before it, and it was much cleaner with Douglas. So in terms of the major topics here, major things that we are going to be talking about. First thing is the cross-section on the spinal cord. And I can ask you what is anterior, what's posterior, what's superior, what's inferior, what's left and right. Assuming that we're looking from the top down, in other words, we're looking from an anterior view down, superior view down. This is going to be the body of the vertebrae will be there, and so as a result, this will be anterior. Okay? Now, as the body of the vertebrae comes around, it forms, I'm not going to draw the whole thing, I'm not going to draw the whole, there's a space between the body of the vertebrae and then the spinal cord, and there's a series of layers. And we'll talk about those layers first. So, let me see here. There's a layer there, there's a layer there, and then there's a very fine layer that follows all the nervous tissue around, and it literally touches the nervous tissue. So there's 3 layers. There's a superficial, intermediate, and a deep layer. Along with those layers, there's spaces associated with that, and then the most superficial portion protection of this is the vertebrae. So that anterior, you have the body of the vertebrae, posterior, you have the spinous process, laterally we have the transverse processes. That vertebral canal is what we're talking about here. And so now if we're looking at it from a superior view, and the reason why I'm doing this is now in the diagram, on the left-hand side is left, and on the right-hand side is right. In terms of, let me see here, if you're looking at the cross-section here, this sort of goes like that. And then there's also on the left-hand side too. Because this is up is anterior, I'm going to label some things now. That first space is, well, let me just label the layers first. The layers, the most superficial layer is called the dura mater. The next layer is the arachnoid matter. And then touching the nervous tissue, covering the nervous tissue, is the pia mater. Sometimes you'll hear, my coffee across the room. Sometimes you'll see the arachnoid matter being written as arachnoid layer. Hold on one second. Then there's tissues, there's layers rather, spaces, I'm sorry, that are associated with this as well. The first space that I marked in green that's adjacent to the body of the vertebrae is the epidural space. And in lab last week, we talked about getting an epidural, how the doctor or the anesthesiologist inserts the needle into that space and then injects the patient with anesthesia. So there's epidural space, epi meaning superficial, and then there's the space right here called the subdural. That's subdural space, and then this is the subarachnoid. So the subdural space and the subarachnoid space are there as well. Those spaces are between those layers of tissue, right? So I can ask questions about what, if you're in the subdural space, what two layers are you between? If you're in the epidural space, what two structures are you between, et cetera. Let me see here. There's this major indentation is called the anterior median fissure. And there is the area where the gray matter that I've sort of colored in, shaded in, and I've labeled gray. All of those neurons in there are lacking in myelin. So none of them have myelin on the axons. Everything else that's outside of that gray area does have axons, myelin rather. If you, let me see here, there's going to be the three areas of the gray matter here. There's two terms for the one that I'm just going to mark first. There's either the anterior or the ventral horn. We'll call it the ventral horn. This is the lateral horn. And then this is the dorsal or the posterior horn. Of these three, the smallest is the lateral horn, so it's the most difficult for me to ask about in a mini practical. That little indentation right there is called the posterior median fissure. It's very small. Oftentimes, I think in one of the models that we have, the anterior median fissure is almost not visible because the anterior median fissure is filled with arteries or veins that are running up and down the spinal cord. So in the gray matter itself, we have one thing that you can't see. I'm going to draw two green arrows here. These two green arrows are going left and right. And then that central circle here. The green arrows are called the gray commissure. The gray commissure is just as the arrows indicate. They send signals from the left side of the spinal cord to the right and from the right side to the left. These neurons are very short, they're not myelinated, and so as a result, they don't send signals very long distance. Let me see here. Yeah. And then, let me see here. Just do it. That red hole there, that central hole there, is called the central canal. It has cerebral spinal fluid in it. It has material, it's produced by the ependymal cells. There are microglia in there, and it's continuous with the brain ventricles. So the central canal and continuous with brain ventricles. The central canal is. And so the brain ventricles are spaces in the brain where we have cerebral spinal fluid that is bathing the brain and protecting the brain. So if you then, so that's everything that we're going to talk about for the gray matter, and the gray matter is going to be sending signals laterally from left to right and anterior to posterior and posterior to anterior. And I'll draw those, I'll put the arrows in a minute. But if I want to draw your focus to the attention to the white matter. The white matter has these blue circles right here, and these blue circles are called columns. And so these columns will either be, they come in two varieties here. They're either anterior or ascending columns or descending columns. An ascending column is going to send a signal to the brain, a descending, and therefore will be sensory, and a descending column will be sending signals to the periphery, and therefore will be motor. So these are littered throughout the white matter, and there's not a specific thing that says this is one column or that's another column. Right? They're hard to identify individually, but these are. So there's ascending or descending columns. Those columns are all around the white matter, so that the white matter is principally involved in sending signals superiorly or inferiorly. It's not nearly as interested or focused on sending signals anterior, posterior, or laterally. Let me see here. So when you're talking about the gray matter is going to be sending signals in this direction. So anterior to posterior and posterior to anterior, depending on what the signal is. So it's going to be sending it anterior, posterior, and then it's also going to be sending it lateral, as I have where the gray commissure is. And now, if we're going to look laterally here, this. So there's four things that I want to label right there. The one on the top there is going to be a root, and it's called a ventral root because this is anterior. So we're looking at the top here. There's the body of the vertebrae, so that's anterior. So this is the ventral root. I can also identify for you an individual rootlet, so I'm going to put the term rootlet there, which is simply a small root. This one is the This is the dorsal root or the rootlet. That swelling in the posterior portion of the extension from the vertebrae or from the spinal cord is the dorsal root ganglion. And in the peripheral nervous system, the dorsal root ganglion is a collection of soma or cell bodies that are basically out of the way of the signal. And then the final thing that I have labeled, or haven't labeled yet, is this is called the spinal nerve. So if you're driving down the street and you're on a two-way street, right, cars can be going both directions. Now, if you're on the ventral route, cars are going to be going in one direction. And then if you're on the dorsal root, and the dorsal root ganglion, cars will be going in the opposite direction. And this is the direction in which information flows. It flows from the periphery to the dorsal root to the spinal cord, from the spinal cord to the ventral root to the periphery, to motor, to either muscles or glands. And then, as what we'll talk about later on, here, there's also going to be a synapse within the gray matter and that synapse within the gray matter is going to, we're going to define a reflex. And we're going to talk about different types of reflexes, some of which are very, very fast, others that have are slightly slower. In this case here, here's one example of a short neuron. The short neuron is found within the gray matter, is part of the central nervous system. Any neurons that are associated with this part right here, the dorsal root or the ventral root, are, regardless of where they synapse, they're part of the peripheral nervous system, and therefore they're going to be myelinated. The ones right here that are going to be running this direction right here are sensory. These are going to be motor. If they're motor, they're going to be sending signals either to muscles or to glands. 3 types of muscles and then different types of glands. This dorsal root ganglion is always sensory, right here. That dorsal root there is associated with the posterior median fissure, and it is posterior. Throughout the white matter right here, there's white matter, there's columns elsewhere on this diagram, right here, so they're littered throughout the white matter. And again, those white matter columns are going to be sending signals to the brain sensory or from the brain motor. Yes?
Well, the signal is going from the sensory and the motor. When they move around the white matter, do they move around the columns or do they move through the columns?
The signal moves, so it depends on the direction of the signal. If the signal is sending if you're sending signals to the periphery, then it sends it right through the white matter, and the white matter doesn't acknowledge it. It ignores the white matter. If it's sending signal to the white matter, so that if that sensory signal is sending signal to the white matter and to the brain, then you're going to react. So if Eliani goes and pulls your hair, right, that signal is going to get from the hair being pulled. Those sensory structures are going to come down here, they're going to go here, and they're going to go a couple of different directions. The first direction is going to be the muscles that are going to be like, ow, right? I just did 2 things at the same time. It doesn't look like it, right? The first thing I did was I said, ow. So now you have to send signals to the muscles that say, ow. Then I pull my head away. Yes, in fact, someone could pull my hair, right? So anyway, I pull my head away. Right? And then I might do this. So now there's 3 things. All of those things are coordinated by the brain. Where does that information come from? It comes from here. It goes here. The first thing that it does, it goes to the motor system here, the ventral root, and there's that coordinated response. The second thing that happens is that, what the hell was that? That sort of acknowledgement in your brain that takes a little while. So is that dangerous or is that something annoying? You know, it's Eliani, so it's annoying. It's not dangerous, right? So you consider the source, you consider the information, right? That takes a little while. So the information is getting sent in multiple directions. In this diagram right here, it's very, very basic. There's only a single synapse right here, but in fact, you're sending signals in multiple directions at the same time. Does that answer your question? All right. This should be very familiar to you. And this is going to be what's going to be on the mini project, part of it. All right. So I will post this later on today. Let's see. So once again, this is discussion of the spinal cord and spinal nerves. Let's see if I can get organized here. All right. when you're talking about the cross-section of the spinal cord, you're talking about the cross-section on the right-hand side of this diagram. When you're talking about the entire spinal cord begins just inferior to the brain. If this is the brain and we take a half a step outside of the doorway, right here, we're no longer in the brain, right? We're no longer in this room, we're in the hallway. So where does that start? Where does that, the foramen magnum? If it's inferior to the foramen magnum, then it's in the spinal cord. If it's superior, then it's in the brain. There are areas of the spinal cord, these segmented areas, these generally the cervical, the lumbar, and the sacral are the most important. There's also the thoracic area, but we're more interested in what's called the brachial plexus. There are a total of 31 spinal nerves. Those spinal nerves are just what I drew in the diagram. I drew one example of one. The spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. They're not part of the central nervous system. When you're talking about the spinal cord itself, it begins, as I said, at the foramen magnum, or just inferior to the foramen magnum, and it ends around L2, somewhere in that area. On the diagram on the right here, you can see where it ends. At this area right here, the conus medullaris. So there's the conus medullaris that is from there, and then the cauda equina, and then there's a structure down here called the filum terminale, which is a non-nervous tissue structure. It doesn't send signals, it's a connective tissue structure. It helps stabilize the spinal cord. The cauda equina is a series of, it looks like basically the most inferior portion of what typically people would say, non-anatomists would say part of the spinal cord, but in fact that's not true. Right? So where my pointer is part of the peripheral nervous system, not part of the spinal cord. If you're in the conus medullaris, you're part of the spinal cord. So if you're going, these enlargements right here, we talk about the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement, the conus medullaris and the cauda equina. Those are major structures within the spinal cord itself. Yes, last week we were talking about, instead of enlargements, we were talking about plexuses, and we talked about the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. That roughly is what these enlargements are. We just talked about the layers and covering the spinal cord. Now, the term for these layers is called they're spinal meninges, and these spinal meninges are continuous with the brain. When they get into the brain, I'm going to use these same terms, but particularly the dura mater associated with the brain is much more developed and much more complicated. There are different spaces associated with the meninges in the spinal cord and then also in the brain. But in those spaces associated with the spinal cord include the epidural, subdural, and subarachnoid spaces. You can see at the bottom here what is found within these areas generally here. So serous fluids, cerebral spinal fluid, and it's not entirely, it's not perfect because there is definitely leakage between these coverings. There's leakage between these coverings, and if you look at the middle layer, the middle covering here, the arachnoid matter is thin and wispy, it has holes in it, and so as a result it allows for the passage of materials from one area to another. The dura mater is pretty tight, and it's much more substantial, it's much tougher. Now, if you look at this diagram and you look at what I drew, right, they're exactly opposite. I didn't do it on purpose, but that's just the way I did it. So this is the body of the vertebrae, this is the spinous process, and the transverse processes. Right? So now, if this is from a superior view, which is what it says here, so this is superior, so now on the diagram here, on the right is the left side of the body. This is the left side of the body where my pointer is, and this is the right side of the body. And again, in my diagram, it's exactly opposite. We have the spaces right here, the epidural space, right here, and that the epidural space, oftentimes, most of the time, is filled with fat and adipose tissue. The spaces then from there are very difficult for me to point out. We know they're there. So there's the dura mater, the subdural space, the arachnoid mater, subarachnoid space. Once you get to the subarachnoid space, then there's the pia mater that is touching it, and you can see roughly that cross section, that H there, the gray matter and the white matter. So when I talk about the white matter itself, the white matter is part of the spinal cord. The way that this is labeled here, it says spinal cord, and sometimes people say, oh, that's the spinal cord, what's the gray stuff? The gray stuff is also spinal cord. It's just different tissue, different nervous tissue. The tissue that has myelin and a tissue that does not. There's also a ligament that I mentioned, the filum terminale, that holds the ligament inferiorly to the bone. There's also ligaments, and I don't know if they're present in the models. These denticulate ligaments hold the spinal cord laterally, and they're meant to basically stabilize the structure. We have two roots off of here. There is the dorsal root and the ventral root. That dorsal root is sensory, and it's associated with the dorsal root ganglion. At that point in the diagram right here, I could point to this point right here or another similar point and say which direction is the information going to, which direction is the information coming from. I could say that right here. I could say the same question right here. I would not, and if I were to say it right here or over here, in other words, at the spinal nerve, which direction is the information going? Both directions. Which information is, which direction is the information coming from? Again, both directions, because it's a two-way street at that point. If you look over on the right-hand side, this, I've already talked about all of these things right here, and deep to the pia mater now. I said that the pia mater is touching the spinal tissue. Now, if you're then go to the individual neurons themselves, there's a structure covering called the endoneurium, the Schwann cell, the axal lemma, and then the axoplasm. That endoneurium I haven't mentioned yet, and I will probably tomorrow. I'll talk about what that is in a second. So continuing on with this, we talked about white matter a little bit, the anterior median fissure and the posterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. Of the two, the anterior one is much, much greater. The white matter is organized in columns. I don't use the word funiculi. There are, generally speaking here, columns located generally within the white matter. And again, those things are going to be sending signals superior or inferior. The gray matter is, as I mentioned earlier, they're associated with dorsal, ventral, and lateral horns. With respect to the gray matter itself, the gray matter has an area of connection between the left and right halves of it called a gray commissure, and that gray commissure is adjacent to anterior or posterior to the central canal. So that's the location there. So if I were pointing to the central canal, I could say what gray matter is anterior to this, what gray matter is posterior to it. The answer to that would be the gray commissure. We've talked about the roots themselves, and I mentioned the term rootlets here. The rootlets, now, depending on what we're talking about here, if we're talking about ventral roots here, the ventral roots, they're going to be, the information is coming from the spinal cord via the ventral rootlets. Those ventral rootlets are going to merge to form the ventral root, and then it merges with the spinal nerve, and then it goes to the periphery. The opposite is true too. You have, when you're talking about the dorsal roots are sensory. So it's coming from the spinal nerves, from the periphery, going to the dorsal root, and then branching off to the dorsal rootlets, and then to the spinal cord. So again, you got to be specific and understand which direction the information is going to and from. If you look at this lower picture right here, I think I have this one right here, and I'm going to back up in a little bit. I'm not gonna be able to ask you, is this going to be an ascending track or descending track? Because there's no distinction here, obviously, where the cross-section of the spinal cord is. So generally speaking, there's descending tracks and ascending tracks, and again, they're gonna be either sensory or motor in information. If you look at all of these terms right here, we talked about the central canal, different parts of the white matter, and we talked about the gray matter and all the different horns. We talked about the gray commissure and the anterior median fissure. All of this stuff right here is what was on what I just drew, I think. Here's an actual cross-section of a spinal cord with stains for the material. So in my drawing and in the other diagrams right here, the difference between the dorsal root and the ventral root is really subtle when you're looking at an actual spinal cord. When you're looking at an actual spinal cord in a dissection, you tend to identify. But when you're looking at it from a slide like this, it's much more difficult. So another set of questions I could ask are about the structures within the dorsal root ganglion. So what function does the dorsal root ganglion have? Is it sensory or motor? It's sensory. In terms of the neurons themselves that are sensory neurons, what type of neurons are we talking about? Are we talking about anaxonic neurons, multipolar neurons, or unipolar or pseudo-unipolar or bipolar neurons? I'm grouping all of those last three together: unipolar, pseudo-unipolar, and bipolar. Basically what those are neurons that, if you look up here, this diagram right here, right where my pointer is meant to illustrate where the cell body or soma is off to the side, and the sensory information is not passing through the soma at all. So basically it's bypassing the soma, and as a result, it sends the signals a lot more rapidly than it would otherwise. In my drawing of my multipolar neuron, the signal gets received by the dendrite, accumulated by the dendrite. Once the threshold is reached, it sends the signal down through the soma, and that time, that space there that accumulates, that passes through the soma to the axon hillock right here. These neurons right here don't really have an axon hillock, so it sends signals very, very rapidly, and it bypasses the cell bodies completely. The motor neurons generally are multipolar neurons. The multipolar motor neurons are getting signals from multiple directions here. So I was talking earlier about Eliani pulling my hair or Jelly's hair, right? And there was multiple reactions to that simultaneously. How are those multiple reactions occurring? Well, the spinal cord and the brain are sending signals to multiple different things, multiple motor reactors. And so those neurons there are getting information from multiple locations via the multipolar neuron system. Okay. Generally speaking, when you react to something in an automatic or autonomic response, it's called a reflex. That reflex can be conscious or unconscious. You can have cranial reflexes or spinal reflexes. Generally speaking here, when you're talking about a reflex, you're getting information from the sensory. So we're talking about these neural pathways now. So now we're going to start talk about examples of neural pathways, and just like what I was talking about a minute ago with hair pulling. So that sensory receptor is going to receive the information. It's going to send it. That sensory receptor here is not a neuron. That sensory receptor is largely a modified epithelial cell, and that modified epithelial cell, so for instance, if it's in your skin, there's modified epithelial tissue that then synapses with the sensory neuron, and that sensory neuron is going to, when it gets signals, enough of those signals to send to exceed that threshold, it'll send signals down the neuron, from that sensory neuron to the interneuron. That interneuron has to be in the central nervous system. right? So and there's two locations, there's only two locations, either in the spinal cord or in the brain. If this sensory neuron is part of the cranial nerves, it's going to the brain. If it's part of the spinal nerves, it's going to the spinal cord. That interneuron then sends a signal to a motor neuron via the ventral root, and that motor neuron, now, I misspoke a second ago. The interneuron absolutely sends signals to the motor neuron. But if they're cranial nerves, they're not going to send it through the spinal cord. If they're cranial nerves, they're going to send signals from the brain down the motor neurons to these effector organs. Regardless of what we're talking about here for the effector organs come in two varieties: 3 muscles and then glands. There's either endocrine or exocrine glands. And then the muscles. So there's cardiac, smooth, and skeletal muscle, and that's all we're talking about. Sensory receptors, there's a number of different varieties of sensory receptors, be they physical, stretch receptors, temperature receptors, pain receptors, etc. We don't talk about those so much this time. We'll talk about them in the next unit, Unit 5. And I've been talking a little bit about, I distinguish between the location of the integration center. So we have reflexes that are cranial in nature and spinal in nature. The spinal in nature ones, those are the most obvious ones that we're going to talk about. There are different types of reflexes. Those reflexes can be somatic or autonomic or visceral reflexes. Those visceral reflexes are not things that are going to be conscious, and so you're not going to know that you're doing it without consciously, right? You might notice a general reaction to it, but it's going to take time. Reflexes also can be learned or innate. So one example of a learned reflex is you're driving down the road and you're in the driver's seat. So hopefully all of you do this. Really, you're not speeding, first of all. And you see lights. I'm in front of you in my Bentley, and you see my wall of red lights. So what is the learned reflex? Hopefully the learned reflex is not to hit the gas. Hopefully for you guys, the learned reflex is to hit the brake, right? You did not need to know that before you learned to drive. So there's an example of a reflex. Hopefully you do that before you hit my $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 car. Innate reflexes. I like talking about Mrs. Gaspar's son. So innate reflexes, he's undergoing lots of examples of innate reflexes. So anywhere from grabbing things innately, right, by putting something in his hand, tickling his foot, suckling, he's getting away from breastfeeding and bottle feeding. He's now more interested in regular food. So there's all of those things that individuals would do without any prompting, with a little bit of learning, but without any prompt. Another example of a learned reflex would be simply standing up and not falling over. And then finally, the different types of reflexes, and we're going to spend a fair bit of time on these two types here. There's different types of reflexes, and if you look at the term that's in front of the term reflex, there's monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Monosynaptic meaning one, polysynaptic meaning more than one or several synapses here. And so they come in different varieties. So right now we're going to stop because someone needs to get her override because she has an appointment. So she paid me $100 to end class early. But we're going to pick up tomorrow, distinguishing between different types of reflexes. Tomorrow's lecture, we're going to finish up this whole chapter tomorrow, and then we're done talking about Unit 4, and Unit 4 exam will be on Monday.
Are we going to have a little review or no?
Maybe tomorrow, yeah.
Hi.